Our topic tonight are issues involving Ireland, especially the peace process. And we're not only honored but deeply delighted to have with us Ambassador Dermot-A.Gallagher, the Irish ambassador to the United States. Ambassador Gallagher was educated at University College Dublin, where he received both his Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts degrees. He joined the Irish Diplomatic Service in 1969, and in addition to various postings at headquarters in Dublin, he served with the Consulate General in San Francisco, at the United Nations, at the British Embassy, and at the Irish Embassy in London. He has no link to any intelligence operations coming from Ireland. As Deputy Chief of Cabinet at the European Commission in Brussels, and as Ambassador to the Federal Republic of Nigeria from 1985 to 1987. He was Assistant Secretary General in charge of the Anglo-Irish Division at headquarters in Dublin, with particular responsibility for policy with respect to Northern Ireland from 1987 to 1991, at which time he then became Ambassador to the United States. It's my great pleasure to present to you the Honorable Ambassador from Ireland, His Excellency Dermot-A.Gallagher.
Thank you very much indeed. I feel a little strange in that this society, clearly from what you said, is living a little in the past. I've been confused initially with Hillary Clinton and then subsequently with somebody who works at the British Embassy in London. But for that said, I'm delighted to see so many people here, and I would endorse your appreciation of the First National Bank of Maryland, which is, of course, a bank that has very close links to Ireland and of which we're very proud of in Ireland. I left Washington, D.C. about 2 hours ago. It's a difficult city to get out of, as you may know. A lot of people try to escape from it, but don't always find it possible. But I've spent 2 hours of a pretty miserable car journey, and I decided to do something coming up here that sometimes I don't do and sometimes I do. I decided to leave aside a formal text which had been prepared for me, and just to speak to you on the basis of a few notes, give you a sense of the modern Ireland, what we're trying to do economically, politically, socially, and in particular with reference to the peace process, and then take any hoping that I've got a sense of it across to you, and then I would be happy to take any questions on any issue that anyone might like to raise. And I will be reasonably brief because, and I know I will be warmly welcomed here as I have already, because on the last occasion I spoke before I went on vacation, and it wasn't here in Baltimore. At the end of the evening, a lady approached the podium with a wry smile on her face and said, "That was I thought she was going to say superb. That was a superfluous speech, Mr. Ambassador." To which, having been raised to always, no matter what the provocation, to be courteous, I simply said, "Thank you, madame." To which she added, to which she replied, to my astonishment, "Are you going to have it published?" At this stage, I felt I should take the initiative away from her. Courtesy only goes so far. So I said simply, "Posthumously." And then, but then, and at this I gave up. But then she quickly and immediately replied, "Well, in that case, Mr. Ambassador, I can't wait to read it." I think all of you have some sense of the modern Ireland. Ireland is an island of 32 counties. 26 of those counties became independent just over 70 years ago at the end of 1921. While they became politically independent of Britain and developed a healthy relationship with the former colonial power, in many ways, economically, they were very, very dependent on Britain for the next 30 or 40 years. So whereas we were politically independent, in many ways, economically, we were very, very dependent on the British market, and almost all of our exports went to Britain. We had a limited number of old and declining industries in the country which operated behind high tariff barriers in a totally artificial situation. And this continued right up to the 1960s. At the beginning of the 1960s, some very wise young people decided, who were in charge in government at the time, and who were very well educated, because one thing we have always done in Ireland is put enormous resources into education. These people decided and advised the government of the day that it was no longer feasible to continue to exist behind high tariff barriers with old declining industries. And we were the only country in Europe at the time with an annually declining population. So we began to plan. We took down our tariff barriers. We applied, and subsequently in 1973 became a member of the Common Market, subsequently known as the European Economic Community, and now known as the European Union. That had a number of effects, which are more and more seen. But in the 1960s, from having no growth, we suddenly began to have growth of 6, 7, 8%. A lot of industries began to be established in the country. A lot of young Irish people who had emigrated came back with enhanced skills to live in the country, because it is a nice environment, a comfortable environment, and an attractive environment in which to raise a family. So suddenly Ireland began to boom and to take off. At the time, and I'll come back to this, people tended to have, by the European standards of the day, fairly large families. So we had a huge growth significant growth in population, and because we were a member of the European community, we began to have a much healthier relationship with our neighbour, Britain. We began increasingly to export to mainland Europe rather than to Britain. When we joined the European Economic Community, something like 75 to 80% of our exports went to Britain. Today, it is way down to something about 30%, and the majority of our exports would go to the European Community. Secondly, and I'll deal with Northern Ireland later, but instead of the relationship being absorbed, instead of Northern Ireland being the dominant, almost the sole factor in the relationship between Britain and Ireland, suddenly British and Irish cabinet members, British and Irish public servants were working side by side in Europe, were sharing sovereignty in Europe with, as it was then, 12 other member states, as it is today, 15 other member states. We're dealing with social security, we're dealing with the environment, we're dealing with industrial policy, we're dealing with agriculture, side by side in Europe, and building up a new and healthy relationship between them. So psychologically, Ireland joining the European community in 1973 was in many ways economically liberating, and some would say almost psychologically liberating. Today, we have in Ireland one of the, I think, most dynamic economies in Europe. There is talk in Europe, and there is a proposal, there is a plan, indeed, it's a commitment that by 1999 we should have one single currency between the 15 members of the European Union, as it's called, of the common market. There are very tight, rigid economic criteria for before members can become a member, can join this economic and monetary union. At the moment, there are about 3 of the 15 states in Europe which meet these very tight economic criteria. They are Luxembourg, Denmark, and Ireland. At the moment, Ireland is experiencing growth of 6 and 7% per annum, where, as one New York firm has called us, Celtic Tiger. We're having inflation of just about 2.3%. And the trick with any economy is to have high growth and low inflation. Our currency is one of the strongest in the European community. Normally, the Irish pound, traditionally the Irish pound, was trading at just less than the British pound. It is now trading at stronger than sterling, and has been over the last 18 months. So all the economic indicators are good except one, and that is unemployment. We had unemployment of 18%, which is enormously high and very costly, and in particular as regards taxation, because we have very good social security. We have brought that unemployment rate down to 12%, but it is very, very difficult to bring it lower than that, particularly given that the Irish economy today is a high-tech economy. Most of the industries are in the high-tech, in the computer area, in the electronics area, and in the financial services area, where a very strong financial services centre has been developed in Dublin over the past 10 years. Because we're a full member of the European Union, of the Common Market, and because that is one of the richest entities in the world today, with the very wealthy consumer population of some 380 million, where it is as easy to sell internally from Dublin to Dusseldorf as it is from here to San Francisco. There are no customs anymore. There are no economic or commercial frontiers anymore. We're of obviously huge interest to overseas industries expanding into the European Union, because the European Union is so attractive to overseas industries, but to exploit it fully, people have to have a foothold within the European Union. And Ireland, for a number of reasons, because we have a low rate of corporation tax, which is 10%, because we have very good telecommunications, and I should say that up to about 10 or 12 years ago, we had appalling telecommunications. We had a third world system of telecommunications, but now we have perhaps, apart from the French, probably the top system in Europe. If you wait long enough, you get it right. I have to add, to be very honest with you, we got it right for the wrong reason, because over the years, successive governments should have invested in developing our telecommunications. They didn't invest. So if you wait long enough, you get it right. But as I said, I think in many ways it's for the wrong reason. But above all, and of course English is the spoken language, but above all, I think that the high-tech industries, and at the moment of American industries expanding in Europe, something like 40% come to us in the electronics and related areas. I think above all the reason is because we have a young, highly educated population. Something like half the population at the moment is under 28. Now that will go up gradually, but at the moment half of it is under 28, and a very high percentage of that young population has university skills, particularly in the engineering and the computer areas. So and it's a win-win situation. The American industries that are establishing in Europe, we find, are expanding their own workforce here, but they're also creating employment in Ireland. So it's a win-win situation. They're creating badly needed jobs for us with our present 12% unemployment, but they're also sustaining and creating jobs here by expanding their markets in Europe. So as I said, it's a win-win situation, and all the high-tech companies, particularly the computer companies in the United States, have now bases in Ireland. Intel have their European headquarters there. It's interesting, I mentioned financial services. Merrill Lynch last year established their European headquarters in Dublin, and I was personally very actively involved in bringing Merrill Lynch to Dublin rather than to Luxembourg, which would be our main competitor there. So in many ways, we are a bridgehead. We're a natural bridgehead between the United States and Europe, both as regards industry and indeed culturally. Because Irish people, you ask them what they are, they'll say we're Irish first, we're Europeans also, but we're very much transatlantic people. And given the history of the two countries, it couldn't be otherwise, because in the last census, some 44 million people said that they were of Irish origin. And Irish people came here. This is the 150th anniversary of the Great Famine. They came at a time of tragedy, political, economic and social in Ireland, but they became a great resource for us here in Ireland. The grandparents and the great-grandparents of Irish Americans today came with very little. But because of this great hunger that there always has been in Ireland for education, they took 2 jobs and they dragged themselves up, and suddenly their children and grandchildren became a great resource, not just for Ireland but for the United States, and became an astonishing success story right across the range of disciplines here, be it in corporate America, be it in universities, in churches, in literature, in law, in the police services, etc. So that is a link that we have, and I don't think any other European country has. So it is natural that there would be this, that Ireland would be the natural bridgehead, would be the natural gatehead for United States industry into Europe. As I said, we have a very good economic incentives package, but so has most other European countries. I think at the end of the day, if you were to ask CEOs and chairpersons of companies here, it boils down to the quality of Irish education and to the quality of young people in Ireland. And what we try to do is have a direct link between our universities and local industries. So if a high-tech industry, say in the engineering area, were to go to our universities, probably they would have somebody on the board of the universities. But if they were to say, look, in 5 years' time, we will need a new kind of specialist, a specialist in engineering for which none of the courses are suitable at the moment, we would in our universities immediately begin to adjust our courses or to introduce a new course that would be directly relevant to what those industries need. And I think more and more in this modern world, if you're going to succeed, you have to do that. I just wanted to say briefly, as I said, that education is the key to it. And we in Ireland have always put huge resources into education. So even if our people have to emigrate, and very few of them are now emigrating, but even if they have, at least they had the skills and the requirements and the training in order to make their way elsewhere in the world. And even we have quite severe inner city problems in Ireland, particularly in Dublin, as any other modern city, or as all our cities have. But at least if you go into inner city Dublin, and there are severe drug problems there, but if you go into the public schools there, you will find a quality of discipline and a quality of education that is possibly as good, if not better, than in the rest of the country. And I think that is critical. If the inner cities in any country are to be brought up, then it is vitally important that the education be good there. And the education in Ireland is almost exclusively public. At one stage, I had my young children going to a private school. I had to travel quite a distance with them. I obviously had to pay. But within 6 months, I withdrew them from it because the teaching was less good than in the local public school, and the facilities and resources available to them were less effective, less good than in the local public school. So we've always put education, put a high price on education in Ireland. I suppose one of the reasons given in the 19th century and 20th century when the country was very poor, it was the way out of poverty and into a successful career. So Ireland's an exciting economy at the moment. That is not to say that we haven't our problems, and our main problem is that we're finding it increasingly difficult to translate growth rates of 6 and 7 and 8%, and which it is envisaged will continue to the end of the century. We're finding it difficult to translate those into employment creation. I turn now to the situation in Northern Ireland. I explained at the beginning that in 1921, 26 of the counties of Ireland became independent. The other 6 in the northeast of the country remained part of the United Kingdom. And that border was drawn so that those 6 counties would have a permanent majority in favour of maintaining the link with the United Kingdom. The 6-county area made absolutely no historic, geographic, economic or other sense. It was purely drawn on a sectarian headcount in order to ensure that there was a permanent majority there for all time. And that is a problem that both the present British and the present Irish government inherited. That 6-county area had its own local government with very considerable powers up to 1972, when the British government, to its eternal credit, decided that it couldn't be reformed and abolished it. It couldn't be reformed because normal democracy could not operate there. If the place is drawn on a sectarian and political headcount, then one party is always in power and one party is always out of power. And the lines were drawn so that approximately 60% of the local population were in favour of maintaining the link with Britain. 40% of the population were in favour of a relationship with the rest of the island. And in many ways, the 60% local majority and 40% are what I call 2 majorities and 2 minorities. And I'll explain that. You have a 60% local majority in the 6 counties of Northern Ireland in favour of union with Britain, but very conscious and understandably very fearful that they're a minority on the island of Ireland as a whole. On the other hand, you have the local 40% who are a local minority within the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, but very conscious that they're a part of an overwhelming majority on the island as a whole. So you have 2 minorities, and with absolutely, as I said, different, conflicting aspirations, loyalties, allegiances, both bottled up in that narrow, what I call the narrow claustrophobic ground of Northern Ireland, but each defining itself in terms that transcend the boundaries of Northern Ireland. The 60% unionists, meaning in favour of union with Great Britain, that 60% defining itself in terms of its Britishness and its relationship with London, the 40% defining itself in terms of its Irishness and its relationship with the rest of the island. So the fundamental problem in Northern Ireland is a constitutional one, it's a political one, it's one not unlike other areas where people are divided on basis of ethnic allegiance, and Cyprus is one example. It's one of conflicting political allegiance, political aspiration, and political loyalty. Now, sometimes people ask if there's a religious dimension to it. There is to some degree, because religion is by and large, though not exclusively, the distinguishing badge between the two communities. One community being largely Protestant, the other community being largely Catholic. But religion, it's not a theological dispute or difference or conflict in any way. Religion, for historical reasons, is, as I said, the distinguishing badge, much like language or culture would be in the Middle East or elsewhere. Fundamental problem is a political one, and the fundamental problem is one of political loyalty and allegiances. Now, the two governments at present are faced with this. It's the last residual problem of a long and sad history between the two islands. We have resolved every other problem between us, and we're determined to resolve this one. We have decided to approach it in a very open way and look at the problem of these two divided communities, divided people within this narrow ground. And we've decided to lift it out of that narrow claustrophobic ground of Northern Ireland and put the problem in a wider context. Of course, the context of Northern Ireland, but also the context of relationships on the island of Ireland as a whole, because 40% of the people see themselves as having a natural and a rightful relationship with the rest of the country, and also in the relationship between Britain and Ireland, which it is. So the kind of solution we envisage would involve some kind of power sharing or responsibility sharing between the two communities in Northern Ireland, because, as I said, you can't have normal democracy there, no matter no matter the quality of the candidate or lack of quality of candidate one side will put up, he or she will be elected, and likewise on the other side. So you can't have normal democracy. Governments never change, as they do in the Republic of Ireland, as they do here, as they do elsewhere. So you'd have a form of power sharing within Northern Ireland, and then you'd have some type of institutionalized relationship in specific areas between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. In other words, between the government there and the government of the Republic, it would be in areas which would make sense. An obvious one is promotion of Irish trade overseas, promotion of Irish industry, perhaps, in the agricultural area, in the environmental area, in the animal health area. So that would reflect the allegiance and the loyalty and aspirations of the 40% of people. It's something that's never been done before. You have, throughout the world, people who are divided on grounds of on the grounds of ethnic allegiance, but nobody has ever devised a system before that both sides can owe allegiance to and get on with their daily lives and make life better for them and their children. I think we can do it if we can get the structure right in Ireland. The two governments, the British and Irish governments, have set out, and I think this is the first time this has ever happened in an area of ethnic conflict. We have set out in detail in a document the kind of structures that we feel will take the passion and the poison of history out of the problem and will enable people to be healed and to be reconciled and to get on with normal living. We have put that on the table. We have said we want all party talks to progress it. We don't want to impose it on anybody. There's been enough imposition in Irish history. But we are saying to people, look, particularly the political parties in Northern Ireland, if you guys have anything better, well, come up with it. And we're prepared to accept modifications. We're prepared to add to or to subtract from the kind of structures that we put on the table. But what is important is that we all get round the one table. Now, all-party talks began on the 10th of June under the chairmanship of Senator George Mitchell. They went into recess for the summer. They have resumed a week ago. They have made some progress, but they need quickly, they're still at the procedural stage, they need quickly to move on to the substantive areas that we spoke about, relations within Northern Ireland and relationships between North and South. What would be extremely helpful to these talks would be if we had another ceasefire. We had a ceasefire for 17 months in Northern Ireland. I don't think the IRA and the Loyalist paramilitaries called ceasefires. The Loyalist paramilitaries ceasefire continued. The IRA broke their ceasefire last February. Interesting, didn't break it in Northern Ireland, but broke it with terrorist acts in Britain. But we had that ceasefire for 17 months. I should say to this audience tonight, I don't think, I'm pretty certain we would not have had a ceasefire, but for the care and the concern and the interest and the courage, and I believe the quality of judgment that was shown by politicians here, in particular by President Clinton. He took a chance for peace. And I should say that the Irish issue has always been a bipartisan issue. Our Prime Minister was here this week, addressed a joint session of Congress. He had an extraordinarily good meeting with the President. He had an extremely good meeting with Senator Dole. So the Friends of Ireland group in Congress is chaired by Congressman Jim Walsh, who's a Republican from Syracuse in New York. So we have bipartisan support, which is the great strength of our position here. But we wouldn't have had a ceasefire but for the quality of judgment and the courage of the President, because in a curious way in Northern Ireland a message from here is listened to on the ground in a way that sometimes they don't listen to their own leadership or they don't listen to the British and Irish governments. And nobody need feel in any way hesitant about what was done to ensure that ceasefire, because for 17 months we had peace, and for 17 and as a result a lot of people are alive today who wouldn't be alive otherwise, and a lot of people are living a normal life who would have been maimed or injured. Our priority is to get that ceasefire back in place as soon as possible, because clearly it can only be helpful to talks if there is a peaceful environment there, and in particular if all parties are around the table, because while there's an absence of a ceasefire, one of the parties on the nationalist side, on the 40% side, Sinn Féin, is not at the table. If there was a ceasefire declared, then they would be there. So we hope that they will be that a ceasefire will be declared and that they will be back at the table before too long. So we're trying, as I said, to achieve something in Northern Ireland that hasn't been achieved elsewhere before. We're trying to establish a model where people who are divided on grounds of ethnic and political allegiance and loyalty and aspiration can come together, can accept structures, and can begin what I call the healing process, and can begin to see that working together there can be a future. It can't be what the structures we establish can't give a victory to either side. That would be wrong. They have to be fair and reasonable to all sides. And what we're trying to do is to get people away from the territorial concept, just thinking in terms of uniting the island of Ireland, because the island of Ireland without the people who live on it is meaningless. It's the partition, the division is in the minds of people. And so we're trying to create structures that will heal those divisions and bring people together at their own pace, working together within Northern Ireland, but also working together between North and South. And as John Hume often says, getting people to spill their sweat together rather than their blood. And if we do succeed in establishing those structures, and I think there is a good chance that we will, it may well be that they will have application elsewhere in the world, be it in Eastern Europe or be it in the Middle East, where people are divided on grounds of allegiance and grounds of political loyalty, where, if you like, people have different constitutional title deeds to a problem. And I think it would be something that would be hugely and warmly welcomed here in the United States if we were to succeed in doing that. And we wouldn't be as far along as we are, but for your care, your concern, your interest and commitment. And we owe a huge debt of gratitude in Ireland in so many ways to our Irish American community, many of whom, of course, live in this city. So on that note of hope, and hope that we will at last resolve this last residual problem of our history with Britain. On that note, I'll finish the formal or semi-formal part of my talk, and I'll be delighted to answer any questions that anyone may have. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for your extraordinarily clear presentation. Mr. Ambassador, would you speak to the problem of the economic problems in Northern Ireland? You spoke earlier of the problems in Ireland proper.
Well, the two economies have grown very differently. I mean, in the Republic of Ireland, we've had very little spillover violence from Northern Ireland, hardly any, in fact. And the police force in the Republic of Ireland, just to give you an example, is unarmed. Obviously, we have a special police force to deal with any spillover from the north of Ireland, but the ordinary police are totally unarmed. So we've been able to advance our economy in a climate of absolute peace, which is, and within the European community, which is why we've been so attractive to overseas investment. Northern Ireland is there has been a conflict going on for 25 years there, and it's going to be very, very difficult to, it's next to impossible, to attract an industry in or to attract senior level management in if people are afraid that they're going to be shot the next day. Now, that's very, very unlikely, but people are not going to move their families into a situation where they feel that they'll be in danger or at the very least uncomfortable. So Northern Ireland has not really been on the radar screens of a lot of most companies considering establishing in Europe. If once there was peace in Northern Ireland, and very interestingly, during the 17 months of the ceasefire, there was a huge growth in the number of US and other companies who were interested in establishing a European foothold in Northern Ireland, because the quality of education is very, very good there. The climate, the environment is very nice. And in a condition of peace, the place would take off. But at the moment, no, it's basically a society that there's a very high level of public spending, and in particular by the British government, there's an annual transfer of somewhere around £5 million from Britain to Northern Ireland in economic support of the area. So there's been very little industrial development. Education is very good. They have some very good universities. High school is very good. In fact, education is very similar to the Republic of Ireland, because people have the same attitude to education. It's a historical thing, as I said. In the 19th century and early 20th century, people saw education as the way out of poverty, as the only means to escape the poverty trap. And whether at home or abroad, ensuring that the next generation had better quality jobs than the previous one. Something like, I mean, it's always been the ambition here that the children would have better jobs than the parents. It's natural, but there was a particular historical reason for it in Ireland because of that huge famine and poverty trap that was there in the 19th century.
The observation was that there have been problems within the Catholic Church. There's been secularization, as there has been on the continent and perhaps here. And the question is, how important is the vitality of the Church to Ireland?
Well, the first answer is we're rather like the United States in that we have a written constitution. And for instance, our near neighbour Britain doesn't have a written constitution. Parliament and parliamentary legislation has complete precedence in Britain. And in our constitution, which dates from 1937, very interestingly, there is no state church, despite, I think, at the time, considerable pressure from the Vatican and elsewhere in 1937 for Ireland to have a state church. We decided no, and in our constitution, the state cannot endow any religion. For instance, if a very beautiful cathedral was being restored, the state would not be allowed by our constitution, which is the fundamental law of the land, to contribute to the restoration of that cathedral. That said, because of the partition of the island, the 26 counties, the Republic of Ireland, at the time left 95% Catholic. And of course that had a very considerable impact on the attitude of politicians and in some of the legislation down the years. For instance, up to about 15 years ago or maybe 20 years ago, the importation of contraceptives was forbidden, was prohibited. That has long since gone. We had, until very recently, as part of our constitution, interestingly, a constitutional prohibition on divorce. That has gone. Now, the Catholic Church, as other churches, but in particular the Catholic Church as the church of the overwhelming majority of the population, has a very considerable influence. And it is important, and it is right, that on issues they, as with any other group, express their views, and that view is listened to very carefully. But the government and legislators have to decide with the interest of the people as a whole in mind. And the attitudes are changing. I mean, you have, as I said, half the population under 28. The attitude of a 25 or 28 or 35 or 40-year-old would be different from that of an earlier generation. So the Catholic Church has an important part to play, as indeed has the other parts, as indeed has the other churches. And will be listened to very carefully. But at the end of the day, the government has to decide what's in the best interest of the people. And the government decided in a certain way, for instance, in bringing in a form of divorce which had to be put before the people in a referendum. Now it's certainly not quickie divorce, it is quite restrictive, but they felt, and in my view rightly, that people whose marriages had irretrievably broken down, and where that was shown to have occurred over a number of years, that they had should have a perfect right under our law to remarry. The Catholic Church fought that battle, or at least many members of it fought that battle, and their view was listened carefully to. But at the end, the government had to decide for the common good. So I don't know if that answers your question. It will always be it is a very strong, vibrant church doing enormously valuable work in Ireland in the social, educational, and indeed many, many other fields, and also with a very dynamic role overseas. As is happening in Europe, of course, the numbers of people joining the priesthood is declining very rapidly. The number of what is known as vocations are very small in Ireland now compared to, say, the 40s and 50s when there were huge numbers. I think there are very few people becoming nuns anymore, and you see that in the property pages where a lot of convents are on the market for sale, and also teaching brothers, very, very few indeed would join. But that's part of, I think, a cycle that most countries go through in Europe. We're probably reaching it a little later than others.
The question is historical. How would you, but with implications for today, how would you have approached the issue of partition in 1921?
You know, it's not easy. I think it was a fundamental mistake. I think short-term solutions are attractive at the time, but sometimes you've got to stand back from a problem and ask yourself, am I storing up fundamental problems for the future? And to divide an area on a purely political headcount where 60% are of one allegiance and 40% the other, and divide it from the rest of the country, which is 95% nationalist, I think was only storing up trouble for the future. And I would have thought that some way might have been found at the time of perhaps having, even if you did partition, which I think was a fundamental mistake, of having some north-south links so that the two areas didn't go their separate ways. But also, I mean, as we see, it was a recipe for instability, because almost in every decade since then, and particularly over the last 25 years, you've had a conflict situation in Northern Ireland in which everybody has lost. The 60% who were partitioned, the 60% who came into power were then given extraordinarily strong powers. It was almost as if they were a sovereign government. The only areas where they didn't have powers were in finance and foreign affairs, but they had their own police force, their own, right across the board, their own ability to make legislation in every area. And they, in a very institutionalized way, set out from the beginning to discriminate in all areas against the 40%. Their thinking was this 40% is a dangerous Trojan horse, a third force. We need to discriminate against it in order to ensure that neither they nor their children have jobs in Northern Ireland. And if they don't have jobs, they'll be forced to emigrate overseas, be it to Britain or to the Republic of Ireland to the south, or to the United States or Australia or elsewhere. And if significant numbers of the 40% emigrate, then the 60% as a percentage of the community will go up. So that was the thinking, and there was institutionalized discrimination against Catholics, against nationalists over 50 years. So much so that still today in Northern Ireland a huge issue is that of fair employment, and an issue that concerns many Irish American organisations. There is quite good fair employment legislation in place at the moment, which, when I was in charge of Northern Ireland policy for the Irish government in Dublin, I actually negotiated on their behalf with the British to put fair employment legislation in place, and we're still trying to strengthen that. So I think it was a recipe for problems down the road, and it could have been handled much better. But governments in many cases, in many countries, including my own, sometimes do take the short-term option as the easy way out. Well,
what is the vitality of the Irish language?
Well, Dias Muragach, and I think I'm probably a good example, because I'm quite close to being bilingual in Irish or in Gaelic and English. The Irish language is mainly, again, it was discriminated against. It's mainly spoken as a daily language by small farming and fishing communities along the west coast. But Irish is a subject which is taught at all schools up to the age of 18, up to and including senior level in high school. At census after census, something around 35% would say they can speak it. There's a very interesting phenomenon which I welcome over the last 5 years, in that a lot of junior schools, that's from the age of 5 to 12, are being established which teach the children subjects through Irish. Now, I myself learned all my subjects through Irish, through Gaelic, up to the age of 18. I think, if I may say so as well, joining Europe was culturally very helpful to the Irish language, because suddenly, instead of being in this claustrophobic relationship with Britain, Irish people were spending a lot of time on the continent, where you can move anywhere on the continent now and have just live and draw social security, if you wish, just as a German or an Italian would do, and they come to Ireland and do the same. But it's been a culturally exciting time in Ireland. It may reflect also the fact that half the population is under 28. We've always been strong in literature, but in other areas we've never been strong in music. But music is going through a cultural renaissance at the moment, both classical music, rock music, U2, cranberries, you name them. We've never had a movie industry in Ireland at the moment. At the moment, there are most exciting films coming out of the country, and I think again that reflects the fact that you have young directors in their 20s directing and coming up with ideas. I mean, Braveheart, a great movie, a Scottish movie, was made in Ireland. Michael Collins is a great film which is just about to come to the cinemas here. So it's an exciting time. The visual arts we were never particularly strong in. For some reason we were dominant in literature and keep winning Nobel prizes, the most recent laureate being Seamus Heaney, the poet. But visual arts is flourishing in Ireland at the moment, and the Irish languages as well. And I think it's a cultural renaissance related to a healthier relationship, because we're in part of the European community, part of a multicultural, multilinguistic community, and also reflecting the fact that half the population is under 28. So it's an exciting time for the Irish language in Ireland. And there's a new television station about to start this fall, which for the first time will be exclusively in Gaelic.
Would you comment further on the educational system, how it's funded and administered, and what a citizen is entitled to?
I should have said earlier, in all honesty, that the two areas where we have a problem are, as I said, unemployment, even though we've brought it down to 12%, and it's going down further. Also, personal taxation in Ireland is high, and that's become quite a political issue, so that all parties are committed to doing something about it at the next election. Education is free in Ireland, was free in Ireland up to and including the end of high school, i.e. up to and including roughly 18. I would say there's a very small private sector which hardly exists at junior school level. You might have, I suppose, half a dozen private schools at junior school level. It's tiny. At senior level, that's from 12 to 18, what we call secondary school, what you call high school, a very small number of private schools. So it's public education. It's free up to the age of 18, totally free. Now, university education was heavily subsidised by government up to last year, but was means tested. So in other words, if your income was below a certain level, it was free, and you also got a grant towards the cost of board and maintenance. Last year, the government decided that fees at university level should be abolished. So up to graduate, not postgraduate now, up to graduate level, in other words, for the first 3 or 4 years, there would be no fees at university level. But there is still a maintenance and grant for people under a certain income. I don't know what the amount, what the figure is. I unfortunately don't qualify for it. One of the reasons, and I forget the technical term, I mean, the reason the government have for some time wanted to make university education free up to graduate level. Another reason was a financial reason. People were, and if there's an accountant, the term has slipped my mind, they were giving a sum of money, covenanting a sum of money to their children for their university education and claiming tax rebate on it then. So the government did the sums. I mean, there was a slight cost, but in fact, if you take out the covenant factor, it wasn't that great. But it's something they wanted to do all the time, because those who could less afford it were paying, in a sense, and those who could covenant it wasn't costing them much at all. So the government decided, look, let's have an even playing pitch for everybody. Let's abolish fees up to graduate level, but the grant for maintenance continues for families under a certain level. And we're delighted also that immigration has has effectively ceased. There's very little emigration because we were putting huge resources into education, and then the kids would emigrate, and other countries were getting the benefit for it. At the same time, we couldn't complain because there's no point in sending people overseas if you're unable to provide them with jobs at home. And it was demeaning that we as a government were not able to provide jobs at home for highly qualified young people. So at least they were entitled, if they went abroad, that they were well skilled and qualified in order to take their place in society and be responsible members of society and contributing to it rather than a drain in any way. And I think anyone who knows the history of Ireland and Irish people in America going back 150 or 200 years know that Irish people have always wanted to assume their responsibility here and have always wanted to contribute to society and not in any sense be a drag on it, and we wouldn't wish it any other way.
The first question was, what is your ratio of public debt to gross domestic product?
It was staggeringly high some years ago. About 7-8 years ago, it was up to 119%. It has progressively come down, and it's somewhere, I think, between 65 and 70 now. It's one of, I spoke of this criteria for economic and monetary union. It's one of the criteria that has to be met. I think the percentage is 50%. We have, on current budget, we have a surplus, which reflects, and we've had for the last 2 years. In fact, for the first time ever, the annual budget in Ireland is at the end of January. The government have a huge surplus, and that just reflects the high growth in the economy and the buoyancy of taxation. So we also, it's a fascinating statistic. We export something like 75 to 78% of what we produce as a country. I think the figure here is around 17%. Now yours is understandably lower because you're such a huge common market in your own right. But we're, with 3.5 million people, we have to export to survive. And we, something like 75, 77% of what our GNP, what we produce as a country, we export it, and clearly have to be competitive to do that. But our rate of, the ratio of debt to GNP has come down from about 119 to somewhere around 65 now.
So your exports are greater than your imports, is what you're saying?
Our exports are very significantly greater than our exports are very significantly greater than our imports. We have a very significant surplus there, and have for the last 5-7 years. But the one exception, by the way, is with the United States. For some reason, you sell us more than we sell you, and we're working on it.
Formally, on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you for making a very serious presentation and presenting it in what, in an Irish spirit, is the most pleasant and enjoyable fashion. Let me also say that we're glad to have a number of non-members here, and I'd like to thank Tim McNamara and others for getting the word out in the Irish-American community. But most of all, Mr. Ambassador, we appreciate you taking so much of your time to be with us tonight.